When Dr. Rachel Morrison became Seattle's most trusted therapist, patients confided their deepest secrets. But when her own dark past and prescription fraud consumed her, she began using hypnosis and lethal injections to murder clients who uncovered her lies, turning therapy sessions into deadly confessions. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. The Pacific Northwest rain created a somber atmosphere outside Morrison Psychology Associates, as Dr. Rachel Morrison prepared her office and reviewed patient files for what would become the most dangerous therapy session of her 15-year career as Seattle's most respected clinical psychologist and trauma specialist. At 44 years old, Rachel had established herself as Washington State's premier mental health practitioner, specializing in treating high-profile executives, entertainment industry professionals, and wealthy individuals seeking discreet psychological care for complex personal problems that required absolute confidentiality and innovative therapeutic approaches. Rachel's psychology practice occupied a luxurious office building in Seattle's exclusive Belltown district, featuring soundproof consultation rooms equipped with advanced recording equipment for research purposes, private entrances that allowed clients to avoid public scrutiny, and a sophisticated pharmaceutical storage facility where she maintained experimental medications for treating severe psychological disorders. Her client roster included tech executives dealing with workplace stress, prominent attorneys managing ethical conflicts, and international business leaders seeking therapy for trauma related to their high-stakes professional environments. The interior of Rachel's practice reflected her commitment to creating safe therapeutic spaces and her understanding of wealthy clients' expectations for privacy and professional excellence, featuring custom-designed furniture, original artwork selected for its calming psychological effects, and walls lined with her advanced degrees in psychology and psychiatry from prestigious universities. Her credentials included board certifications in multiple psychological specialties, published research on innovative therapeutic techniques, and testimonials from grateful clients whose lives had been transformed through her groundbreaking treatment methods. But beneath Rachel's reputation for therapeutic excellence lay a dangerous combination of identity fraud, prescription drug trafficking, and systematic murder that had transformed her practice into a predatory operation where vulnerable clients who discovered her secrets met deadly fates. "Good afternoon, Dr. Morrison," said Harrison Blackwood, her 4 o'clock appointment, and a 63-year-old pharmaceutical executive whose recent merger negotiations had triggered severe anxiety and paranoid ideation that had been escalating over several months of intensive therapy sessions. Harrison was worth approximately $50 million from his company's recent acquisition deals and had developed complete trust in Rachel's to help him manage the psychological pressures of corporate leadership while maintaining absolute discretion about his business vulnerabilities. "Good afternoon, Harrison," Rachel replied, with the empathetic warmth and clinical expertise that had made her legendary among Seattle's psychologically aware elite who viewed her as both healer and guardian of their most intimate secrets. "I've prepared some advanced therapeutic techniques for today's session that will help us explore the deeper roots of your anxiety while developing more effective coping strategies for managing the psychological demands of your executive responsibilities." Harrison had become Rachel's most dangerous client, not because of his psychological symptoms or his demanding personality, but because of his recent discovery of inconsistencies in her professional credentials and his growing suspicions about her true identity and the legitimacy of her psychological practice and research activities. What Harrison didn't know was that Rachel had been systematically murdering clients for over 3 years, using her knowledge of psychology, hypnosis, and pharmaceutical compounds to eliminate patients who threatened to expose her criminal identity and fraudulent therapeutic practice. Rachel's transformation from legitimate therapist to calculating killer had begun 6 years earlier, when her real identity as Sarah Collins, a former psychiatric patient with a history of violence and identity theft convictions, had been discovered by a suspicious colleague who had conducted background research. Faced with exposure of her criminal past and the collapse of her carefully constructed psychological practice, Rachel had murdered the colleague and decided that eliminating threatening clients was essential for protecting her profitable therapy business. Her criminal activities had been facilitated by her extensive knowledge of psychology, pharmacology, and mind control techniques that she had learned during her psychiatric treatment and had weaponized to exploit vulnerable, wealthy individuals seeking psychological healing. Her first patient victim had been Dr. Patricia Williams, a prominent psychiatrist who had recognized signs of Rachel's personality disorder and had begun asking questions about her qualifications and therapeutic methods. Rachel had murdered Dr. Williams using a combination of hypnotic suggestion and lethal injection that had convinced the psychiatrist to participate in a dangerous experimental therapy session that had resulted in fatal drug overdose while appearing to be a tragic suicide brought on by professional stress. The success of her first murder had convinced Rachel that killing suspicious or wealthy clients was both necessary for protecting her identity and extremely profitable when combined with systematic inheritance fraud and insurance manipulation. Over the following 3 years, Rachel had murdered 12 additional clients using increasingly sophisticated methods that combined psychological manipulation, hypnotic control, and pharmaceutical poisoning to eliminate potential threats while providing access to substantial financial assets through forged wills, coercive estate planning, and insurance fraud schemes. Her victims had included Robert Chen, a tech entrepreneur whose cryptocurrency holdings had been transferred to Rachel's accounts through coercive psychological manipulation during therapy sessions; Jennifer Martinez, a wealthy socialite whose estate planning had been altered to benefit Rachel's research foundation; and David Foster, a prominent attorney whose suspicious death during a therapy retreat had been attributed to pre-existing mental health conditions rather than deliberate murder. Dr. Morrison, I need to discuss some serious concerns about your professional credentials and several suspicious deaths among your clients, said Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a clinical psychologist from the Washington State Board of Psychology who had been investigating complaints about Rachel's therapeutic methods and had begun conducting a comprehensive review of her practice. Dr. Rodriguez possessed extensive expertise in identifying fraudulent psychological practitioners and had access to resources for exposing criminal activities in mental health settings. Dr. Rodriguez's investigation represented an existential threat to Rachel's criminal operation, as her professional expertise and access to psychological regulatory systems could expose the systematic fraud and connect her to multiple suspicious client deaths. Of course, Dr. Rodriguez, Rachel replied, though she felt the familiar surge of rage and paranoia that accompanied any scrutiny of her therapeutic methods by mental health professionals who possessed the expertise to recognize her fraudulent credentials and psychological manipulation techniques. I'm always interested in discussing the innovative therapeutic approaches that have made my practice so successful in treating complex psychological disorders that traditional methods often fail to address. Dr. Rodriguez consulted detailed credential verification reports and licensing investigations that she had compiled based on complaints from former clients and their families, pointing to specific patterns of credential fraud, inappropriate therapeutic relationships, and suspicious client deaths that indicated systematic criminal activity rather than legitimate psychological practice. Rachel, I've been investigating numerous complaints about your therapeutic methods and credentials, and I've discovered evidence of systematic fraud in your professional qualifications and licensing documentation, Dr. Rodriguez said with the regulatory authority that had made her successful in exposing fraudulent mental health practitioners. Additionally, several of your clients have died under suspicious circumstances that appear to be connected to experimental therapeutic techniques and pharmaceutical interventions that are not approved for clinical use. Your actual identity and professional background don't match the credentials you've been using to practice psychology. The regulatory investigator's identification of the credential fraud and her recognition of the suspicious death patterns confirmed Rachel's worst fears that her criminal activities had been detected through professional oversight systems and would soon be reported to law enforcement agencies with expertise in medical crimes. Rachel's response was swift and deadly as she realized that eliminating Dr. Rodriguez was essential for protecting her criminal operation and preventing exposure of her systematic fraud and murder spree. Dr. Rodriguez, I think your investigation may be influenced by competitive jealousy and resistance to innovative therapeutic approaches that challenge traditional psychological paradigms, Rachel said while discreetly reaching for a prepared syringe containing concentrated succinylcholine that she kept hidden in her desk for emergency elimination of regulatory threats. Perhaps you could experience some of these advanced techniques directly so you can understand the profound therapeutic transformations that occur when clients commit themselves to cutting-edge psychological healing methods. I have prepared a private consultation room where we can explore these deeper therapeutic processes. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to observe Rachel's therapeutic techniques, not realizing that the psychologist was leading her into a soundproof room where previous murders had been committed and where Rachel planned to inject her with the succinylcholine that would cause fatal respiratory paralysis while appearing to be a heart attack brought on by the stress of regulatory investigation work. Rachel's plan involved administering the succinylcholine injection while Dr. Rodriguez was examining her therapeutic equipment, causing immediate muscular paralysis and respiratory failure that would be attributed to the occupational hazards of psychological regulation rather than deliberate murder by a fraudulent therapist. But Rachel's carefully planned murder of the regulatory investigator was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of FBI agents who had been investigating identity fraud and prescription drug trafficking networks with connections to her psychological practice. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into identity theft and prescription drug trafficking operations that exploited legitimate professional licenses to commit systematic fraud and pharmaceutical crimes. Agent Walsh specialized in investigating healthcare fraud and had developed expertise in tracking criminals who used stolen or fabricated credentials to establish fraudulent medical practices. The federal investigation had been initiated by reports from pharmaceutical companies and insurance organizations who had noticed unusual patterns of prescription drug orders and insurance claims associated with specific psychological practices that suggested systematic fraud and illegal drug distribution. The investigation had focused on Rachel's practice after discovering that she had been operating under a false identity and had previous convictions for identity theft and pharmaceutical crimes. Agent Walsh had been conducting surveillance of Rachel's operations and had documented evidence of systematic identity fraud, prescription drug trafficking, and suspicious patterns of client deaths that suggested her psychological practice was being used as cover for organized criminal activity. Rachel Morrison, I'm Special Agent Walsh with the FBI, she announced as she entered the consultation room where Rachel was preparing to murder Dr. Rodriguez. I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of identity fraud, illegal distribution of controlled substances, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic exploitation of psychological clients and fraudulent medical practice. Rachel's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of narcissistic rage and desperate attempts to maintain her psychological authority as she realized that law enforcement agencies had been investigating her identity fraud and had connected her practice to systematic criminal activity. Her carefully constructed reputation as an innovative therapist had failed to protect her from federal investigation into her criminal background and fraudulent professional activities. Special Agent Walsh, you are interfering with groundbreaking psychological research that could revolutionize mental health treatment, Rachel said frantically, while abandoning her plan to poison Dr. Rodriguez and attempting to maintain her therapeutic persona despite the overwhelming evidence against her criminal activities. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist conducting advanced research into innovative therapeutic techniques that transcend traditional psychological approaches. The transformations that occur through my methods are beyond the comprehension of those who remain limited by conventional thinking. Dr. Rodriguez looked absolutely shocked as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the therapist she'd been investigating for credential fraud. Her regulatory investigation had not only exposed Rachel's systematic identity fraud and murder operation, but it also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who'd been using psychological practice as cover for systematic elimination of clients and regulatory threats. The comprehensive investigation that followed Rachel's arrest revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods she had developed to exploit psychological practice for systematic fraud and murder. Forensic analysis of Rachel's practice revealed extensive evidence of her identity fraud operations, including false credentials, fabricated licensing documentation, and detailed records showing systematic exploitation of client vulnerabilities for financial gain and murder. Her pharmaceutical supplies included stockpiles of controlled substances obtained through fraudulent prescriptions and sophisticated equipment for administering lethal injections disguised as therapeutic treatments. The investigation also uncovered Rachel's extensive network of accomplices who had been helping her maintain her false identity and had been participating in the systematic exploitation of psychological clients. Her criminal organization included corrupt pharmaceutical suppliers who had provided illegal drugs and dishonest administrative personnel who had helped fabricate her professional credentials and licensing documentation. Most disturbing was the discovery of Rachel's detailed research into psychological vulnerability and her development of increasingly sophisticated manipulation techniques that had been refined through years of exploiting grieving and traumatized individuals who had trusted her with their mental health and emotional recovery. Rachel Morrison was ultimately convicted of 13 counts of first-degree murder, identity fraud, illegal distribution of controlled substances, conspiracy to commit systematic psychological manipulation, and numerous other charges related to her exploitation of therapeutic relationships for criminal purposes. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout Washington State's mental health community, prompting immediate reforms in psychological licensing, credential verification, and client protection protocols. The case became a landmark example of how fraudulent mental health practitioners could systematically exploit vulnerable individuals' psychological needs to commit large-scale fraud and murder, while hiding behind the facade of therapeutic healing. Several other psychology practices in mental health facilities were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of the mental health industry and new requirements for comprehensive background verification that made it more difficult for criminals to exploit psychological practice for systematic abuse. Dr. Rodriguez and Special Agent Walsh received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in psychological crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying fraudulent mental health practitioners and protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by predatory therapists. Harrison Blackwood and other surviving clients required extensive deprogramming and alternative therapy to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted therapist had been systematically manipulating and planning to murder them while stealing their assets. The mental health industry implemented comprehensive new safety protocols designed to protect clients from exploitation by unethical practitioners. The case prompted comprehensive changes in mental health regulation, including mandatory background checks for all psychological practitioners, enhanced credential verification systems, real-time monitoring of therapeutic relationships, and new reporting procedures for suspicious therapeutic activities involving client manipulation or financial exploitation. Rachel's conviction also led to increased cooperation between mental health licensing boards and law enforcement agencies investigating psychological crimes, with new protocols designed to identify therapists who might be using psychological practice to exploit vulnerable individuals for criminal purposes. The psychology and broader mental health industries implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced screening procedures for practitioners, comprehensive client advocacy programs, mandatory reporting of suspicious therapeutic manipulation, and improved training for recognizing signs of fraudulent practice and psychological abuse in therapeutic settings. 5 years after Rachel's conviction and life imprisonment, Seattle's mental health community continued to implement safeguards designed to protect vulnerable clients from therapists who might abuse their positions of trust and psychological authority for criminal purposes. The therapist, who had promised to heal psychological wounds and guide clients toward mental wellness, had instead used her psychological knowledge and position of trust to commit systematic fraud and murder against the very individuals who had trusted her with their most intimate thoughts and emotional vulnerabilities. However, her crimes had been thoroughly exposed and her victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept suspicious therapeutic deaths as mere mental health tragedies. Rachel Morrison's final session had ended in her permanent imprisonment, where she would serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, proving that even mental health professionals who attempted to exploit their psychological expertise for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated regulatory experts and law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent clients from predatory therapeutic practitioners. The therapist's final session had become her ultimate therapeutic conclusion of justice, serving as a lasting reminder that the sacred trust between healers and those seeking help must never be violated, and that those who would abuse psychological authority to harm vulnerable individuals will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of therapeutic ethics and human compassion. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.